Good evening and welcome to us here at Broadcasting Scotland to Scotland at 7. My name is Donald C. Stewart and I am delighted tonight to be joined by a very good friend of the programme, William Duguid. It's great to see you, William.
Hello, Donald. Great.
So we start this evening, as we always do here at Broadcasting Scotland, with the Ukrainian update on day 279. Fighting around the key eastern Ukraine town of Bakhmut has descended into a bloody morass, with hundreds of dead and injured now being reported daily. Russia has moved fresh formations into the area in recent weeks, but neither the Russian nor the Ukrainian forces have made a significant breakthrough after months of fighting. Russian forces continue to shell residential infrastructure and housing in the recently liberated city of Kherson, according to the Ukraine's military. The United States is announcing new aid to help Ukraine restore electricity as the country faced another week of cold and darkness after Russian strikes on its power grid caused rolling blackouts. In response, DTEK, Ukraine's biggest private electricity producer, said it would reduce electricity supply by 60% for its consumers in Kyiv. National grid operator Ukrenergo said on Monday it had been forced to resume regular emergency blackouts across the country after a setback in its race to repair energy infrastructure. Ukrainian forces damaged a rail bridge north of the Russian-occupied southern city of Melitopol that has been key to supplying Russian forces, according to the Ukrainian armed forces. Russians are sporadically shelling cities with no apparent strategic aim other than to cause casualties. Ukraine's Prosecutor General's office has said that 329 children are considered missing in Ukraine, while 12,034 have been deported to Russia. According to the Ukrainian government's Children of War portal, 440 children have been killed as a result of Russia's war, and 851 children are reported as injured. Russia has unilaterally postponed talks with the US aimed at resuming nuclear weapons inspections in Cairo this week, according to a US State Department spokesperson. And the Ukraine war hotline between Russia and the United States has only been used once, according to a Reuters source. The communications line was created at the start of the war. The official, who spoke on condition of anonymity, said that the United States initiated a call on the deconfliction line to communicate its concerns about Russian military operations near critical infrastructure in Ukraine. William, winter is here, and I know that in February the invasion began, and I think that there was some discussion at that time about it being the right time for the Russians to start invading because they could get into the country easier. But now, with the infrastructure being literally blown apart, it looks as though it's a very tough and difficult period ahead for the Ukrainians.
Well, yes, it does. And those military advances they were making when they were pushing the Russians, and then the Russians decamped to the other side of the Dnipro River, now turn out to have, if you like, the platform for the Russians to do just this sort of series, this barrage of assaults on the Ukrainian civilians from a relatively safe area where they can't be got at. So it's not a good situation. And with winter coming on and no ability to fix the problems with the electricity supply because it's just constantly fixing holes as the weather gets worse and demand goes up. Yeah, I can see this being very difficult indeed. And we should all be putting pressure on that we can to try and prevent this happening because this this I mean, war is hell. It's always hell, and it's always violence against civilians, and it's always total war. But this is just unacceptable, and in any just world would be answerable as a war crime. Ultimately, it won't be because of the world, the global situation, but that's where it should be.
And down in Westminster today, it was announced that John Nicholson MP faces a conduct inquiry for exposing that Nadine Dorries was avoiding punishment for misleading the Commons Committee. MPs have voted for a Privileges Committee investigation into John, and it started with what seemed to be a minor and technical breach of parliamentary etiquette, but it escalated into quite a row, and one which illustrates fault lines apparently running through the chamber. It all started when Mr Nicholson wrote to Sir Lindsay Hoyle, the Speaker, asking if he would allow a debate on a motion about Nadine Dorries, telling the Commons Culture Committee that Channel 4 faked a reality TV programme when there is no evidence that that was true. Mr Nicholson asked Mr Hoyle to allow a debate on a motion saying the Privileges Committee should investigate her for misleading Parliament, but the Speaker said no. John Nicholson then posed this on Twitter, making the whole exchange public. He wrote, "I know many of you are following the story of how Nadine Dorries misled the House of Commons Culture Select Committee on which I sit. The committee issued an excoriating report about her. I sent a copy to the Speaker asking him to take action. Have a listen to his response to me," and what followed was part of his response. On Wednesday last week, Mr Hoyle lashed out at Mr Nicholson in a statement to MPs. He said that MP's correspondence with the Speaker was private, that Mr Nicholson had given a partial and biased account of his letter on Twitter, and that Mr Nicholson had not apologised. In response, John Nicholson said the Culture Committee had published a unanimous report criticising Nadine Dorries for her remarks, and that people wanted to know what happened to an MP who misled a committee. Mr Nicholson did not apologise in the chamber last week, and the Tory Member of Parliament, David Davis, tabled a motion saying that he should be referred to the Privileges Committee for an investigation. MPs debated it this afternoon, and it passed by 371 votes to 16. John Nicholson spoke in his own defence, saying that he did not know that he was not allowed to reveal the contents of Hoyle's letter, and that he was not criticising the Speaker. He also said that Nadine Dorries was not being punished for misleading a committee, while he was being punished for revealing that. Pete Wishart MP said he did not know about the rule saying correspondence with the Speaker was confidential, despite having been a Member of Parliament for more than 20 years. He claimed that what was happening to John Nicholson seemed like institutional bullying. Well, William, will John Nicholson have to spend some time in the naughty step, or will he be chased up the chamber by somebody brandishing a sword in one of these archaic things that happen in the House of Commons? Or is this a rule for one, but not a rule for another?
Well, to a certain extent, you can see it as double standards. Technically, I guess it's a breach of the rules, even though John Nicholson didn't know about it, and neither did Pete Wishart, once putatively a candidate for the job of Speaker, know that correspondence from the Speaker is confidential. But this is not a particularly good look, because the fact is that the committee report did excoriate Nadine Dorries, who had traduced the reputation of Channel 4, and it is legitimate to ask whether this is a fit person to be put in the House of Lords. But it's not a good look to be pursuing a whistleblower on a technicality when the original miscreant escapes justice. There looks to be, it was a fairly cross-party vote against John Nicholson today, a bit of a ganging up, a bit of a double standards, and ill-treatment of a whistleblower. And from purely an SNP perspective, I think they will be able, with some success, to justify or to point to this rather as an example of the Commons being institutionally flawed. And I look forward to the next piece of action on that score. I'm getting my popcorn order in early for this one.
I suppose in many ways it's one of those things that you see from a distance and you wonder why it is created in that particular way, to find that people who have been there for decades are unaware of the minutiae and it's almost like, that school thing of don't walk on the left hand side. Why? Just don't, rather than an adult, mature conversation about what it is and why are the reasons those rules are there.
Yeah. The UK needs to be a grown up democracy, and it isn't at the minute. It's an archaic load of old nonsense half the time that goes on in the House of Commons. Perhaps there's some strategic value in John Nicholson drawing attention to that. I'm not sure what the ultimate sanction for what he's done will be. That may have to wait for the investigation, which is a sort of big word for just basically hauling somebody over the carpet, really. But yeah, let's get us out of here. As I say, we're a democracy. Get us out of here. That's my response to this whole thing.
And from one load of old nonsense, we move to yet another, as businesses have said that Brexit doesn't work. Business leaders warn they have no understanding or interest in the government's plan for post-Brexit deregulation. In a survey of 938 businesses, just 14% specified an EU regulation they would remove. 58% have no preference over the amendment or removal of any EU regulation, and half, 50%, have said deregulation is either a low priority or not a priority at all. It follows separate analysis from trade economists which show that more than 40% of British products previously exported to the European Union have disappeared from European shelves since Brexit. Commenting, the SNP's international trade spokesperson Drew Hendry MP said, "These latest figures highlight once again that Brexit does not work. Brexit has and will continue to be an unmitigated disaster for households and businesses across these islands, reducing Scottish exports by a staggering £2.2 billion in the last year alone. For Scotland, rejoining the European Union as an independent country and thus rejoining the single market would help boost trade and improve our economy. But with Labour and the Liberal Democrats abandoning their pro-Brexit stance, this can only be achieved with independence." William, we heard, of course, from Sir Keir Starmer that it was no EU, no way is the only way now to leave the UK so that we can rejoin the commonwealth of mature nations that is out there waiting for us to come back.
I think it may be. There is a school of thought that thinks Keir Starmer is playing some sort of four-dimensional chess when he says, let's do Brexit better. I'm really not convinced that he's a master in regard. So that leaves us really with independence as the only way. Brexit, as businesses have been saying for quite a while, they're saying it loudly, and it's beginning to be picked up in the BBC and other places, which it wasn't previously. Brexit was effectively an anchor attached to them before they even faced all the crises that businesses the rest of the world have been facing the last 2 or 3 years. So, to start with, staff shortages now everywhere are routine. There's fruit unpicked and there's businesses in significant jeopardy. I really don't know what's going to be happening to the hospitality sector and the tourism sector as we go forward. And as for food producers, I mean, it's just a write-off. If you stack up, as I think one agency did, the trade deals that have actually been agreed and those that are being confident, and you add them all together, they are in no way a substitute for access to the single market and all the loss incurred or are incurring as a result of leaving in that way. It's not even what anybody voted for. When we decided 52-48 as UK as a whole to depart from the EU, it was not envisaged that it would be a hard Brexit as it ultimately was. And I don't think this one is finished yet. I think it will be a long time before it is fixed for the UK. And I very much hope that Scotland has its own rather more streamlined way of getting back into the EU sorted out well before then.
And I suppose politically, one of the things that has become more of a myth than the reality was that the Conservative Party was always seen as being the business party, being the one that would be safe with the economy. And yet the unmitigated, unparalleled, unbelievable disaster economically that we've seen, from mini budgets to hard Brexits and so on, to the point now that I cannot find a business leader anywhere who believes that what they had voted for or wanted is actually what's being delivered. And this has got no business benefit whatsoever.
Yeah, I believe the Conservative government, I'll get to the Scottish government later, I believe the government of business, for all that represented. I mean, it was bad and horrible and wicked in so many other ways, but at least it was looking after business. Now it's looking after maybe big business, more likely hedge funds. It's been taken over by an ideological wing that just wants to rip everything up and hand the proceeds over to those who are already wealthy to make them even wealthier. And businesses in general, particularly small businesses, can support that sort of thing. It's just not in their interests. The game is now stacked against them, and the previous reputation of the Tories is shot.
And as we move from the politics of it, the reality of it has hit home today. As the Salvation Army have published a survey that finds 2/3 of adults are worried about being able to afford a Christmas dinner this year. New research has revealed that 2/3 of adults are worried about being able to put that very celebratory meal on the table for their family. The findings from the Salvation Army reveal that of 2,149 people surveyed, 67 expressed concerns over the rising cost of food and energy. 38% are likely to skip a Christmas dinner altogether, and 16% expect to use items from food banks for their meal on the 25th. The survey also found that 1 in 7, that being 14%, cannot afford to give their children a Christmas present this year. Nearly 1 in 5, around 18%, expect to spend time over Christmas in a building that is free to visit so that they can simply keep warm. Commenting, the SNP's Shadow Chancellor Alison Thewlis MP said, "The Tories are the Grinch, set to steal Christmas for millions of households with their austerity policies and failure to get a grip of inflation and rising living costs, pricing families out of their Christmas dinner. It's a damning indictment of how bad the situation has become when families can't expect to be able to enjoy the holiday season, with many household savings being wiped out entirely by the Tory-made cost of living crisis. Rather than delivering real and targeted support to deal with rocketing costs and bills, the Tory government instead imposed an austerity budget which will further entrench the poverty the Tories have caused." And I suppose, William, one of the greatest worries is that this particular family celebration for some may suddenly sound like a luxury item, like many other luxury items that the poor are pointed at and told that they shouldn't be affording, but they should be going and getting on their bike and go and find jobs elsewhere and so on. So it's yet another attack on those who are struggling, especially at this time of the year.
It's definitely an attack on those who are struggling at this time of the year. Christmas is because there is performative pressure, isn't there, to lay on as much as you can, and particularly if you have kids, to do right by them. And not to be able to do so is a source of distress for people, but also a sort of shame. It's not a justified shame. They shouldn't feel that way, but they do and they will. And it's shocking that this is the case in what is still, despite the best of the government over the last years, one of the more rich countries in the world. For people all the time, not just Christmas, to be one problem away from financial disaster, one failed MOT, one broken down boiler, having to contemplate spending Christmas in warm spaces that are provided out of charity, because it's going to be too cold at home if it's during Christmas. It's a red flag for the creep of poverty that's getting ever deeper in. And whereas the autumn statement didn't go quite as far as it might have done in making things worse, it certainly isn't making things better fast enough or getting money into the hands of people who could spend it and grow the economy that way, because that's all the money I get. It's words fail me. It's not going to be a Christmas like any other. So let's see what it goes like.
And further news in terms of the cost of living crisis was today, where a call for the UK ban on prepayment meter installations, PPMs, made under court warrants were made from campaigners who have asked for these court orders to be suspended because of fears that energy suppliers are using them to disconnect the poorest, most indebted customers by the back door. Energy firms' licence conditions protect many vulnerable people from formal disconnection over the winter, but the End Fuel Poverty Coalition said transferring households onto PPMs, which require regular top-ups and charge for energy at a higher rate, often prompted people in debt to self-disconnect. The body, which represents 60 organisations made up of anti-poverty charities, health campaigners, local authorities, unions and consumer organisations, said 20,000 households a month are currently being moved onto PPMs as energy firms seek to protect their revenues. For cash-strapped households, being moved from a credit meter to a PPM can mean the difference between having heating or not, as they suddenly find themselves having to pay up front for energy with money they don't have. Earlier this month, Citizens Advice warned that it had seen more people unable to top up their prepayment meter in the first 9 months of 2022 than it had in the whole of the previous 3 years combined. Assault on the poorest, William, and creeping red flag of poverty. This is one area that what we're seeing is that people are finding it increasingly difficult to do something, and so therefore they are self-disconnecting. They're taking themselves out of a warm place because they simply can't afford it.
Yes. They don't want to be in debt because the consequences of that are unforeseeable but undoubtedly bad. But imposing prepayment, as some of the energy companies appear to be doing, sometimes through the medium of, I think, smart meters being remotely switched from credit to prepayment, which is, I suppose, a red flag against accepting a smart meter, which was supposed at one point. But that kind of behaviour is wrong, and it is not in accordance with the rules for how the electricity company should be working. But the government is not being strong enough about protecting consumers rather than protecting the electricity companies. There could be temporary legislation to suspend the requirement on suppliers, the obligation they have to prevent customers falling into arrears, which is what they're trotting out as an excuse for doing this. But that's not happening, and therefore they can justify it. But everybody knows, and everybody knows, and we are only beginning to see the harmful effects. We haven't had a really that's coming. Rumours just in the last week of a beast from the east. If we get one of those, God knows where we. Not good, and action required. I don't see it coming soon, though.
No, it's very for many families, the length and breadth of the UK, not just in Scotland. This must be an exceptionally worrying time, because you can see that the temperatures dropped. We're now at freezing in many parts of the UK. It's going to get worse, and the idea of not being able to afford your Christmas dinner, not being able to afford the Christmas presents, and then on top of that, potentially come January, February, not being able to heat your own home seems just poverty upon poverty upon appalling upon appalling.
Well, the biggest thing about it is it's not just a short-term thing you just have to get through. You don't know when it will end, because you'll probably be facing this next year and the year after, and it never ends. That grinds you down, and that's the source of all sorts of things, from mental health issues to um, genuinely bankruptcy and whatever might follow from that. That's the real thing about poverty. When, let's say, one of our MPs decides, I'll show people how for a week, and they go and they live on the streets, or they live on a budget, and they do it, and they think, look, why can't you do this if we can do it? And the answer is, can you, who've just done that, do it week upon week upon week, face the grind, face always having to make compromises, always having to disappoint your children? It's unsolved and shouldn't have it in today's society.
Of course, if they were to be put on the streets, or indeed to deal with these situations, they would probably claim in a committee at some point in the future that it was all actors and it was all unreal, and it didn't actually happen. However, further worrying news today came that uniformed soldiers are to cover for striking UK Border Force staff. Soldiers standing in for the striking Border Force staff will wear their uniforms while checking passports at ports and airports, according to The Guardian today. About 600 servicemen and women will wear combat attire as they provide cover for members of the PCS union who have voted for industrial action. The soldiers are receiving 5 days of training at venues in Folkestone and Heathrow before taking up jobs, including checking passports and identifying trafficked children. Border Force guards usually receive a minimum of 3 weeks training. Soldiers could also be expected to process people coming across the channel in small boats amid an expected increase over the next few weeks. Union sources indicated that strike action could be pursued over the festive period in a dispute over demands for a 10% pay rise, job security and redundancy terms. It raises the prospect of hours-long queues at airports and ports over Christmas, when millions of people will be travelling cross-country and abroad to see families and friends. The disclosures came after the government was warned by senior MOD officials that the Army's resources could be left extremely thin, by also asking members of the armed forces to cover for striking workers this winter. The Home Office has also drawn up plans to use the military to cover for firefighters who will be balloted next week over strike action. Health and Defence officials are drawing up a contingency strategy as ambulance drivers and paramedics consider joining nurses on the picket line. Mark Sawotka, the PCS General Secretary, said it was an outrage that the government was drafting in uniformed military personnel with a few days' training to break a legitimate strike. William, I have to say the thing that jumped out to me here is you're trying to come to a safe haven, and the first thing you're going to come across is somebody in military uniform. But it goes beyond that. We've got strikes potentially in a variety of different emergency services, and we know that the Conservative Party in 2019 wanted to ban those strikes and take away the right to strike, and Sunak has confirmed that that's still his intention and his plan. This seems almost third worldy, tin pot dictatory, like the military is being spread about in our communities, and visibly so.
Yes. I remember going to the USA just after 9/11. It was about 6 months after, and seeing armed at the posts, and feeling slightly uncomfortable about it. I certainly didn't want to forget to take my mobile phone out of my pocket because somebody might have got excited. It's not actually a good look to have people in attire running the border post. But the wider problem, yes, is there is an excuse, if you like. There is a reasoning behind using the armed forces, not so much to break strikes, but to keep essential services going. when people are on strike. It's not the answer to ban strikes, which are a legitimate expression of the workers standing up for themselves, and particularly, leading decent pay rises just to keep in line with inflation. But it's not the answer to be saber rattling about it and saying we're going to strikes and make what we're doing currently illegal. The government needs to sit down and think about funding public services properly in the new situation in which we find ourselves, so that people can have a pay rise at its pace with inflation. I guarantee you MPs will be doing quite soon. And that we just get through this, that we can turn it into a temporary blip in the economy rather than something that grinds people down for years to come. I still think we are in with a fighting chance of a general strike at some stage in the next 6. It wouldn't surprise me in the next. And maybe that's what it will take in order to get some sort of action, proper action, to fix the quandary in which we find ourselves.
And as we move from one series of or set of institutions to another, the BBC has announced that it's planning deep cuts to Northern Ireland's coverage. It's planning to make deep cuts in a move that could centralise the broadcaster's coverage of the region in Belfast. BBC Radio Foyle, based in Derry, will be reduced to a skeleton service without its own news updates or a breakfast show. The outlet, founded in 1979 at the height of the Troubles to provide more localised coverage of Derry with its own reporters and presenters. It is the latest victim of the government's licence fee freeze and UK-wide decisions by BBC managers to shift money away from traditional radio and television stations and into digital products. One BBC Northern Ireland employee said of Radio Foyle, "It's a radio station for 100,000 people. But during the Troubles, global stories were coming out of it on a regular basis. It's part of the tapestry of the place. People there don't feel well served by Belfast, and they don't feel that Belfast will reorientate its coverage." About 36 staff will lose their jobs as a result of the cuts, which will save £2.3 million, with further redundancies expected next year. Multiple staff at BBC Northern Ireland suggested there should be a renewed look at some of the salaries paid to managers and senior presenters, such as Belfast-based Stephen Nolan, who earns £415,000 a year for his work across the BBC. Colm Eastwood, the leader of the SDLP, the Social Democratic and Labour Party, said the cuts to Radio Foyle were a shameful attempt to shut the station down by stealth. If there are cuts to be made, it should be in some of the outrageous wages that the BBC currently spends. Our local station and listeners should not suffer because the BBC lack the will to upset their highest earners. William, the BBC is always open to some form of criticism, but this is not in isolation. This is one of our latest of cuts. They made huge swinging cuts, the BBC, to the radio drama department, where many of our leading theatrical performers and indeed television performers started their career. And this just seems another cut along the way to reduce the output culturally within the UK.
Yeah, and we're badly enough served for regional broadcasting in the UK, and particularly acutely, as you know, in Scotland, and I think too in Northern Ireland, because Radio Foyle was very much a voice for people in Derry who would not have felt well served by just having something pasted over them from Belfast. Centralisation is where the BBC is rapidly beginning to go now as it scrambles, and it's finding finances difficult, just as everyone else is. I would argue that you expensive presenters because you pay for quality. Personally, I'm not entirely convinced about that, because I think that it's a market just the same as any other. But certainly, making cuts is not necessarily the way to benefit the service overall. you also your new talent as it comes up, and you might be able to pay your new talent a bit less. So this is, I'm not really surprised to hear it from the BBC. I feel aided by all the BBC says and does in Scotland, and I'm not surprised to see it kind of replicated in other areas as well. We'll just have to see what happens and what other things might spring up to replace what gets cut.
And if the BBC have been accused of making questionable decisions over in America, Jewish American conservatives have condemned Donald Trump for meeting the anti-Semite Nick Fuentes. Several Republican lawmakers and prominent Jewish conservatives have condemned him for meeting with Fuentes in a rare distancing from the former president. Trump's former Vice President Mike Pence, the former New Jersey Governor Chris Christie, and several Republican senators were critical, to varying degrees, of course, of Trump, who has come under fire after dining with Fuentes last week. Fuentes, described by the chief executive of the Anti-Defamation League as among the most prominent and unapologetic anti-Semites in the country, met Trump with Ye, the rapper formerly known as Kanye West, who has repeatedly made racist comments about Jewish people. President Trump was wrong to give a white nationalist, an anti-Semite and a Holocaust denier a seat at the table, said Mike Pence in an interview with News Nation on Monday. He continued, I think he should apologise for it, and he should denounce those individuals and their hateful rhetoric without qualification. Jewish conservative figures also spoke out against Trump, including Jay Lefkowitz, a former advisor to George W. Bush. The meeting with Fuentes, a Holocaust denier who has repeated the racist white genocide theory, was not the first time Trump has engaged with racism. After deadly clashes at a white supremacist rally in Charlottesville, Virginia, Trump declared that there were very fine people on both sides, and he told the far-right Proud Boys group to stand by during a presidential debate. William, there's not much that surprises me when it comes to my namesake over in America, but this does take us to somewhere else. And it's rather bizarre, given his decision to move the US Embassy into Jerusalem from Tel Aviv and his courting of the Jewish leaders within Israel at that time. But then again, it may be that his attempt for 2024 is already doomed to failure. And perhaps this is his true colours finally emerging.
Well, he may be trying to placate different wings of what he perceives as his party or his constituency. Certainly, he's by no means having it away already, even amongst Republicans, with his run for 2024. And the spectre of Ron DeSantis is out there, and no doubt others who may stand as well. Trump has never ever apologized for anything, as far as I'm aware. This is spectacular lack of judgment, but it may also represent invincibility. Trump can break the mold. He can do things that nobody else does because he's Trump and the normal rules don't apply. But, you know, this has been the playbook in various ways, as you've said, in Charlottesville with the Proud Boys over the and no, it's a new low, but it's no surprise. And I'm sure he's got some other things in his locker that we'll be seeing similar things about. But the key thing is he's not to do it without comment from opposition. So it's looking, you may remember sort of 2 or 3 weeks ago when we were together in the programme one other Tuesday night, I thought almost certainly win in 24 if he stood. I am not saying that now. The reaction over the last few weeks to Trump has been a surprise to me. And I'm not sure I like what might be there in place of Trump on the Republican, but it's good to see that he's looking through this stuff anymore.
Absolutely, and we go from one form of abuse internationally to domestic abuse within Scotland, which have decreased by 1% in 2021-22, the first decrease since 2015 to 16. Cabinet Secretary for Justice and Veterans Keith Brown is encouraging people experiencing domestic abuse to seek help, advice or support, and where appropriate report incidents to the police. Official statistics for 2021-22, which were released today, show a 1% fall in the number of domestic abuse incidents recorded by the police. Of these, just over 4 in 5 had a female victim and a male suspected perpetrator. It is the first time since the groundbreaking Domestic Abuse Scotland Act, which criminalised psychological domestic abuse and coercive and controlling behaviour and came into effect in 2019, that the number of reported incidents has fallen. However, the most recent results from the Scottish Crime and Justice Survey for 2018 to 20 estimated that fewer than 1 in 5 cases of domestic abuse are reported to the police. Since the launch of the 2018 Domestic Abuse Scotland Act, Scottish Government has introduced a range of measures to create a victim-centred justice system which helps people feel more confident in reporting crimes. This includes establishing a domestic homicide review task force to help prevent homicides in Scotland where domestic abuse is suspected, providing £26.5 million of funding to courts in 2021-22 to maintain enhanced court capacity, helping to address backlogs, introducing new evidence by commission suites to improve the experience of vulnerable victims when providing evidence for court cases, and awarding £48 million of funding to 23 organisations in Scotland over the next 3 years through its Victim-Centred Approach Fund, including £18.5 million for specialist advocacy support for survivors of gender-based violence. The 2023 programme for government also commits to a consultation on new justice powers to tackle misogynistic behaviour, helping to address the root causes of inequalities and men's violence against women. The Scottish Government is also considering the possibility of a specialist sexual offences court to help improve victims' experiences of the justice system. Well, and once again, not news that's necessarily going to be trumpeted or heralded in many places, but practical attempts to try and address what is a very, very serious topic.
Yes, it's a serious and it's a complex topic with perhaps many causes, so it's difficult to address, and I think probably what the Scottish Government is doing is making as good a fist of addressing it as you might. The big question always with these things reducing is how much is being reported, and as you say, if it's true that 1 in 5 of all domestic abuse cases are reported and the rest are not, then a 1% is probably neither here nor there. But nevertheless, I suppose to what is this? It's good. I'm not sure what else I can say, because there are so many background causes to this, some of which have been exacerbated in recent years. Lockdown was not good for mental health in general, and mental health issues may be part of the stresses that lead to increased domestic abuse. Stresses that lead to increased domestic abuse, you might think, because once life becomes intolerable, all sorts of consequences might spring from that. So it's very difficult to say whether this is really good or really bad, or whether we just need a much more holistic approach, which we could do if we had more of the levers. But there is that old argument about independence creeping in yet again.
Indeed, it's that hairy old chestnut we constantly go back to. But you know, it is that thing that you're absolutely right. The pressure cooker of poverty, of austerity, of ladling on the possibility of not being able to afford so many things is likely to increase the tension that can lead to an explosion, literally, of violence and abuse. And the most vulnerable in our society are once again going to be at the business end of that. And whilst 1% may not be a particularly a huge change, NHS Scotland have today announced that long waiting times have been reduced by 20%. For more than 2 years, waiting times have been reduced by 20% for both outpatients and inpatients, according to latest Public Health Scotland statistics. The number of outpatients waiting over 2 years decreased from 2,633 in the quarter to the end of June to 2,114 for the period 1st July to 30 September. And there was a 22% reduction in the number of patients waiting over 2 years for inpatient and day case procedures, from 9,787 to 7,612. Since the introduction of new targets in early July, progress in tackling the long waits continues, with almost 53,500 patients seen in the quarter to the end of September, which is the highest number in one quarter since the start of the pandemic. Health Secretary Humza Yousaf welcomed the new figures, saying, "We recognise the impact long waiting times have on a patient from both a clinical and mental health perspective, which is why we announced ambitious waiting time targets to address the backlog of planned care." William, the 20% reduction, you read those figures, you see that people waiting for that period of time is too long. There are too many, but there is certainly a move in the right direction. They're going in a positive way. But one has to wonder, if we had those levers in our hands, could we do more?
Well, we could certainly do more, but NHS is a huge and complex beast with a lot of problems that have accumulated over years of underfunding, and I mean underfunding really that's come through for the Scottish Government to spend, and something over which they have no control, but also exacerbated in the last 2 to 3 years by COVID, which services all across the UK. I actually think that things like waiting times for procedures are arguably more important than A&D waiting time. And you at least have the triage, so that the most important or most serious cases are dealt with first. So waiting becomes usually an inconvenience rather than a disaster. But for people waiting for procedures, a long wait is a disaster. It can radically affect the outcome of what ails you. But in any event, it means that you suffer pain and discomfort much than you otherwise should have done. So I think it's absolutely right that if they're having to prioritise what they fix, and I'm sure they are, that the waiting times for procedures should be the one they try to tackle. And a 20% increase is not to be sneezed at. Not even touched by BBC Time Bulletin. They were far interested in A&E, but I hope that they're able to continue it. I fear that the squeeze on finances from inflation costs, and also the squeeze on resources from staff shortages, will continue to be an issue. But in the light of that, this is a very good result. Let's hope that they can keep it up and even improve it. And then let's get the proper second due course, and you know how that.
Indeed, and of course, it's. I'm quite sure that the Health Secretary nor the First Minister will be waiting for a congratulatory comment from Douglas Ross and the chamber at Holyrood. But it's interesting to see the good news. The fact is that there is progress. Sometimes gets swamped by the criticism that, justified or unjustified, is somewhere else. And what we should be looking at, we call for balance quite a lot, and there doesn't often seem to be that balance in play.
There's no balance because in Scotland, uniquely, the health service is politicised. If you look at on the health service in any other part of the UK, they may talk about bad stuff. The political element is not there. That's the one thing that's unique to Scotland. And frankly, it needs to stop, because it's not helpful. It doesn't help the staff who are trying to cope with a huge backlog, a load. It doesn't help their morale. It doesn't help the way they feel valued. And it doesn't actually get anybody treated any better, because looking into what's wrong and poking with it, rather than encouraging the people trying to do things better. And we should catch them doing something right occasionally, as well as things going wrong. And I wish we had a better culture of reporting in that way.
Absolutely. And one of the things that we end, in fact, tonight with is one of the last of St Andrew's Lost Medics awarded degree after 53 years. And what is a delight to bring you news of, the 75th birthday of this particular Lost Medic. She has discovered that she has finally graduated with the medical degree she began at the university 53 years ago. As a child, Judith Coles dreamed of becoming a doctor, but she faced battling a system heavily weighted against women studying medicine. When she discovered only 10% of places at London medical schools were being awarded to women, she changed tack and applied to study elsewhere. In 1966, she was offered a place to study for a BSc in physiology in St Andrews, and after a 12-hour-long train journey from her home in northwest London, she arrived in the old grey town to begin the course with hopes of transferring to study medicine at a later date. Having never travelled any further north in Derbyshire, she wondered where on earth she had come to. Offered a bunk in student lodgings run by the formidable Mrs. Dillon, and I'm quite sure there were many formidable women running their establishments in the 60s, and her daughter in Murray Park, with 7 other girls sharing just one bathroom, with 1 bath a week, and a warning that no man was ever to put a foot over the doorstep. Judith's experience of student life looked very different to that of today's students. However, her decision to study in St Andrews was what she called the best thing that could have happened to me. After a year of studying zoology, physics and chemistry, she performed well enough to persuade the medical school to allow her to transfer, and she completed the medical preclinical course and second MB exams in 1969. And while most of her fellow students then went on to undertake a further 3 years of their clinical training in Dundee, family circumstances led to Judith moving to Sheffield University, where she gained her MB-CHB medical degree in 1972. After working in Sheffield for another 4 years and training towards becoming a hospital physician, Judith moved back to London, where she completed higher specialist training at the Middlesex Hospital. In 1983, she was appointed consultant and honorary senior lecturer in geriatric medicine in Wandsworth, South West London, based at St George's Teaching Hospital and Medical School in Tooting. Judith was involved in running acute inpatient rehabilitation and community services, had teaching responsibilities at the medical school, trained junior doctors and specialty registrars, and held management positions in the hospital trust. She retired in 2017. And William, my hearty congratulations, 53 years after beginning your degree. I think that some of my former university lecturers probably thought it would take me 53 years to come to the end of my studies, and I wonder if they were actually right. But it's good to end on a high note, but certainly, 1960s, that sounded like a harsh environment.
It sounds like a harsh environment. She's had a fine career and well merits the recognition she's belatedly had. I think the complication was that Dundee became a separate university in 1967, and that was a problem for everybody in her year. But of course, when the university recognised it about 35 years later, and did something about it, they failed to include her because she'd gone to Sheffield instead. But she was encouraged to inquire about it, and perseverance pays, and that's a good story as well. So, yeah, a heartwarming story to end the evening with, and I'm very delighted for her, and she deserves it.
Absolutely, and of course, great warm wishes from here at Broadcasting Scotland. And to you, William, thank you very much for joining me this evening with the usual smorgasbord of news, ideas and opinions.
Oh, you never know what's going to come up. You really don't.
Absolutely. Well, that is it for this evening. And before I go, I just want to remind you that here at Broadcasting Scotland, we depend on the generosity of our supporters. So to everyone who has donated and to everyone who has signed up to make a regular monthly payment on behalf of us all here at Broadcasting Scotland, thank you very much. We have always committed to ensure that our programmes will always be free to view. However, if you can afford as little as £5 a month, we would ask that you please consider becoming a Broadcasting Scotland supporter. If you're not able to, can I ask that if you're on Twitter or any of the other social media platforms that you send out the news that we are here and we're broadcasting on a regular basis. We really do benefit from that type of support as well, because we've set ourselves a target of adding 10,000 new subscribers, which would enable us to employ staff to make more programmes here and might actually allow some of us to work out whether or not Keir Starmer can do four-dimensional chess. But from me, Donald C. Stewart here in the studio, and from all of us here at Broadcasting Scotland, it's good night and thank you for watching.